All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be diving deep into the thought of a really significant Islamic philosopher.
Yeah, a big name. Mulla Sadra,
Yeah, Mulla Sadra.
sometimes called Sadr al-Din Muhammad Shirazi,
hmm
but yeah, most people just call him Mulla Sadra.
Yeah, lived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, and he's considered arguably the most significant Islamic philosopher after Avicenna.
Or if you had to pick a number two, it'd probably be him.
Yeah.
Yeah. He was given this really cool title later on, Sadra al-Muta alihin,
hmm
which means master of the theosists.
Oh, wow.
So, I mean, that kind of gives you a sense of like his stature and also what he was known for, right?
Yeah.
This real deep combination of theology and mysticism.
Right, yeah. And I think that's, one of the things that we're going to try to unpack a little bit today
Yeah.
in this deep dive is how he kind of brings these different things together. And, we always want to make these deep dives accessible to, anyone who's kind of interested in these topics. But today especially, I think it's going to be a deep dive that I think is really going to resonate with those of you out there who really consider yourselves, philosophically minded.
Yes.
Because I think there are a lot of fascinating kind of connections between Mulla Sadra's thought and, the broader philosophical tradition.
Absolutely, yeah. Like you said, it's not just a historical overview, right?
Yeah.
This is, think of it like we're going to be dissecting some of his core ideas,
Yeah.
his metaphysics, his views on knowledge,
Yeah.
and seeing how those really resonate, especially for someone, who's already kind of deep into philosophical inquiry.
Yeah. So our mission today is to kind of unpack some of his core ideas about philosophy itself.
Okay.
Right, like how he even defines it. We also want to look at his kind of unique metaphysics.
His metaphysics of existence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And how he approaches knowledge, and all of this is in this context of how he kind of wove together reason,
Right.
spirituality, scripture.
Yeah.
So many different threads.
A lot of threads. Yep.
So, I think a good place to begin would be how does Mulla Sadra even define philosophy?
Right. Right. Where do we even begin? Yeah. I mean, for Mulla Sadra, I think the key
Yeah.
is to realize that philosophy for him wasn't just kind of,
Yeah.
an academic subject, right? Not just like a rational inquiry. It was really, really almost like a way of life
hmm
aimed at this ultimate goal of wisdom,
Right.
which he really tied to this idea of what's often called theosis, or becoming godlike.
Ah, okay.
Right? And this idea actually resonates deeply with, the Neoplatonic tradition.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
It brings to mind, figures like Plato.
Yeah.
And, if you've ever read the dialogues like the Theaetetus, for example,
Right.
where he talks about, the pursuit of knowledge being very much tied to the soul's ascent.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just about the mind, it's about the whole person.
So there's a real transformative dimension to his view of philosophy.
Absolutely. Yeah. He talks about this idea of the perfecting of the human soul
Mm-hmm.
through knowledge. Right. But he's very specific about what kind of knowledge.
Right. Yeah.
It's not just, any kind of information gathering, right?
Right.
It's about understanding the true natures of existence,
Okay.
which he makes very clear have to be ascertained through demonstrations, through sound arguments, through logic.
Okay. So no conjecture.
No.
No blind authority.
None of that.
It's really got to be rooted in reason.
Exactly, yeah. You got to work for it.
Right, which I think resonates, with kind of the core of philosophical inquiry itself.
Right.
But there's this other element, this other dimension that you mentioned earlier, this kind of spiritual discipline.
The spiritual, absolutely, yeah. And that was, key to his view as well. He really saw it as a twofold discipline.
Okay.
On the one hand, you have this rigorous training of the intellect, right? Honing those tools of argumentation, analysis, critical thinking.
Okay.
But equally vital, he said, were spiritual exercises, things that you do to cultivate within the soul those kind of divine qualities, things like wisdom and justice and piety. So he saw those two going hand in hand.
And he actually articulated this kind of, really beautifully in his own definition of philosophy. I think we were both thinking of the same one.
Yeah.
It's from his book, The Four Journeys.
The Four Journeys, exactly. Yeah. It's a dense book, but he really nails it with his definition. He says, philosophy is the perfecting of the human soul.
Okay.
Through knowledge of the realities of beings as they are in themselves, and judgment concerning their existence proved by demonstrative arguments to the extent that this is possible for a human being. And then he goes on to talk about how through this process, the individual achieves likeness to the Creator and comprehends the rational order of the universe.
So much packed into that.
Right. It's like a whole treatise in a single definition.
It is, yeah. Likeness to the creator, I mean, we're back to that theosis idea.
Look.
But then he also grounds it so clearly in demonstrative arguments,
Yeah.
in that kind of really rigorous philosophical tradition.
He doesn't want you to just take his word for it.
Yeah.
He wants you to really think it through. Yeah.
But what really strikes me about this definition is the ambition.
It's ambitious.
It's not just about like intellectually understanding things. It's about transforming the self through that understanding.
Exactly. And I think for him, that ties to this kind of really deep metaphysical aim,
Mm-hmm.
right? To move beyond just like the surface appearances of things, the phenomena,
Yeah.
and really grasp those underlying, true essences of reality. And that's not just like a mental game. That's really about an internal shift.
Right.
Almost like a curing of the soul. He uses this analogy of like how medicine cures the body.
Right. Yeah.
Philosophy is like medicine for the soul.
Wow. That's beautiful. And really crucial to Mulla Sadra, I think, is this idea that, this sound philosophical understanding that you arrive at through this rigorous inquiry, it actually aligns with, what prophets know.
That's right. Yeah, like the metaphysical insights that prophets have.
Right.
He doesn't see them as being in conflicts.
Right.
In fact, he sees them as ultimately converging.
Wow. Okay. So now, given that, I'm curious, how did he see like religious texts fitting into this?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So for him, Scripture, he saw it as a kind of a means of accessing, very deep insights into the nature of reality. He even saw the act of interpreting Scripture, right, as a process of inner transformation, where engaging with the text can actually lead to, changes within the soul.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And through those changes lead to a deeper comprehension.
Okay, so that makes sense. It's all very integrated, right?
Yeah, very much so, yeah. It's not like you can separate these things out neatly for him.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about how he defines philosophy, but how did he think you should actually do philosophy?
Yeah, what's the method?
Yeah, what's the methodology here?
So his approach, it's really characterized by this kind of interesting interplay of, I think, three key modes or elements.
Okay.
The first is something we've already been talking about. Philosophy as a lived experience.
Right.
It's not just detached, purely intellectual. It involves spiritual disciplines.
Okay.
The striving for what's often called, marifa, which is a kind of experiential knowledge, right? And the cultivation of virtue and good action.
So the ethical dimension is really important.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
For him, intellectual insight and moral refinement they go hand in hand.
So the more you understand, the better you become.
That's the idea, yeah. And he explicitly talks about, philosophy as an art of self-improvement.
Oh, wow.
He says it's a way to heal the soul from what he calls the disease of irrationality.
Interesting. Okay.
Right. So it's not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about, becoming a better person.
Yeah, becoming whole.
Becoming whole, exactly.
Yeah.
And he even echoes, this wisdom that's attributed to Imam Ali, where he says, the study of wisdom requires spiritual exercise and forsaking the world.
Interesting. Okay, and what was the second kind of key element or mode in his methodology?
So the second is this really fascinating integration of, philosophical and spiritual reasoning.
Okay.
And here, he's really following in the footsteps of, Islamic Neoplatonists, especially a figure like Suhrawardi.
Right.
Mullah Sadra saw philosophy as part of a continuous lineage of prophetic wisdom. He traces this genealogy all the way back to, to Adam, through the prophets, through, the sages of ancient Greece.
Oh, wow.
To the Prophet Muhammad, and then extending, through subsequent generations of Muslim philosophers and mystics.
So he really saw it as like an ongoing tradition of wisdom.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like this inheritance that's being passed down.
Wow. Okay.
But, he wasn't just saying, hey, let's just repeat what people have said in the past.
Right.
He really emphasized that, for understanding to be genuine, it has to be grounded in experience.
Okay.
And it has to be illuminated by, by grace and revelation. It can't just be a purely abstract intellectual thing.
Right. Okay. So that's two. There was a third, right?
There's a third, yes. And that was his emphasis on bringing together this kind of, ratio-senative knowledge, the logical knowledge, with more intuitive forms of knowing.
Okay.
What's often called, knowledge by presence, or al-ilm al-huduri al-shuhudi.
Right.
And this was something that, Suhrawardi had also explored. But Mulla Sadra really grounds it in his own metaphysics, in his own understanding of existence.
Yeah. Okay. And this knowledge by presence, like how does it work? What is that?
So it's this idea that there's this kind of direct, unmediated apprehension of reality.
Okay.
Where the knower is present to the known without the need for these intervening concepts or representations.
So it's almost like a direct intuition?
It's very much like a direct intuition.
Yeah.
He saw this as really essential for understanding things like, divine knowledge,
right?
But even our own awareness of, our inner states, our thoughts and feelings.
Okay. So how does he kind of square this with the emphasis on reason that we've been talking about?
Right. So he didn't see them as being opposed. He actually saw them as being complementary.
Okay.
Where this knowledge by presence kind of serves as the foundation, right? The ultimate source of certainty.
Yeah.
And rational inquiry is kind of, pointing us in that direction. And in connection to that, he also really defended this idea from the philosophical tradition, the idea of the identity of the intellect and what is intellective.
Right. Yeah, iri had alaquil walmakul.
Yeah, which Evatin actually had, famously criticized.
Right.
But Mulla Sadra really embraces this. He says, ultimately, there's this kind of unity between the knower and the known.
Okay.
At the level of being, of existence.
That makes sense, given, what we've talked about with his views of existence, which I think we should turn to now.
Okay, yeah. Let's dive into that metaphysics.
Because that is, really where I think he's often considered to be the most revolutionary, right?
Yeah, a real game changer.
So, how did he transform or revolutionize Islamic metaphysics with his ideas about existence?
So it starts with this fundamental distinction,
okay,
right? A distinction between, what he calls the necessary existent, which is God, and everything else,
right,
which are contingent existence.
Right.
So he's saying God is pure existence. Okay. Absolutely simple. There's no, essence to God. There's no, attributes that are, limiting God. God just is.
So it's pure being, pure isness.
Pure isness. And you can see echoes of this actually in, in Avicenna's idea of radical contingency.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so God is existence. But then how does everything else, how does their existence relate to God's existence?
Okay, so for everything else, for contingent beings, Mulla Sadra argued for what's called the ontological primacy of existence.
Okay.
Or asalat al-wujud.
And this was a big deal, right?
It's a huge deal, yeah. Because he was basically saying that existence is the fundamental reality.
Okay.
It's ontologically prior to essence.
Right, so that was a real break from what had been, the dominant kind of essentialist view.
Right, which said, no, essence is first. That's what something is. And then existence is just kind of like an added attribute.
Right.
But Sadra flips it.
Okay.
And he even connects this idea to, the Sufi notion of wadat al-wujud.
Right, the unity of being.
The unity of being, yeah.
Where, God is the ultimate reality and everything else is somehow, participating in that.
Yeah, exactly. God is the simple reality. He even uses this phrase, Besit al-hakika kul al-asha, which means, the simple reality encompassing all things.
So rather than things having a predefined essence and then they kind of, come into existence,
right,
it's more like existence itself manifests in different ways.
Yeah. Existence is the primary thing.
Right.
And the essence is just kind of like the way that it's appearing.
Yeah, like a mode of appearance.
A mode of appearance, exactly.
Okay, so how does he kind of, flesh this out further?
So he fleshes it out further with this idea of, the modulation and gradation of existence.
Okay. Tashkik al-wujud.
Tashkik al-wujud, yeah. Big word.
Right.
But the basic idea is this. Existence is one.
Okay.
It's a single unified reality.
Okay.
But it's not uniform. It has these different degrees of intensity and perfection. So the multiplicity that we see in the world, right? All these different things.
Right.
It's not because they're fundamentally different kinds of being. It's just that they're participating in this one reality of existence to different degrees.
So it's kind of like a spectrum.
It's like a spectrum.
Yeah.
Exactly.
God is at the very top.
At the apex.
Yeah.
The most intense, most perfect.
And everything else is, kind of arrayed below that.
Exactly, yeah. And this actually allowed him to deal with this old problem.
Yeah.
From the Aristotelian tradition. This problem being predicated in many ways.
Right.
Yeah. He was saying, look, existence is what's common to all things, But the way that they exist, that differs.
Yeah.
So there's both commonality and distinction grounded in this one reality of existence.
And this gradation of existence, it helps to explain spiritual hierarchies.
It does, yeah. He uses it for that.
But also still affirms that, even human existence is one, right?
Yeah, yeah. At a fundamental level, we all share in this one reality of existence.
It's just that, some of us are more, I don't know, realized than others.
More actualized, maybe?
More actualized, yeah.
And he summarizes this beautifully. He says, existence is a single reality, but it admits of priority and posteriority, perfection and imperfection, strength and weakness.
I like that. Okay. And this idea of, this dynamic view of existence, this graded view of existence, it really leads into his really fascinating concept of substantial motion, right?
Yes, yes. Haraka Jafariya.
Which is one of my favorite things to think about.
It's a mind bender for sure.
Yeah. So tell me, what is this concept of substantial motion?
Okay, so the basic idea is that substances themselves,
Okay.
right, not just their accidents, but the substances at their very core are in a constant state of flux.
So it's not just that, like my shirt can change color.
Right.
Or I can move from one place to another.
Right, right. Not just accidental change.
Yeah.
It's the being itself that's changing.
Yeah. So the very being of the shirt.
Exactly. Yeah.
The very being of me is in constant flux.
Like in motion. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's becoming, and this is, it's such a radical departure from, how Aristotle thought about substance.
Right.
Right. Aristotle thought, okay, substances are relatively stable, and what changes are their accidents.
Yeah.
But Sadra says, no, the substance itself is changing.
And this has really, fascinating implications for so many things in philosophy.
It does, yeah.
Like the nature of time.
Yeah.
The idea of creation.
Absolutely, yeah. He uses this to explain, the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo.
Right.
Creation out of nothing, which is, a key theological idea.
Right, right.
And he's basically saying it happens in every instant.
Because everything is in this constant state of flux.
That's right, yeah.
And time itself, he doesn't see time as like this separate thing.
Right.
It's really, an aspect of this ongoing, substantial motion.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
It's woven into the very fabric of existence.
Okay. So now I'm wondering, how did all of this, really intricate and really radical metaphysics of existence, how did it, inform his arguments for the existence of God?
Right, right. So he offers his own proof, which he calls the proof of the veracious, or Burhan al-Siddiqin.
And this is really grounded in this metaphysics of existence.
Absolutely.
And it differs from, those kind of earlier cosmological proofs that you find in, Kalam theology.
Yes.
Even from Avicenna's proof.
That's right, yeah. It's distinct from both of those.
So how is it different?
So the key difference, I think, is where it starts.
Okay.
Right? The traditional cosmological proofs, they start with the observation of, contingent existence.
Right.
And they say, well, there has to be a first cause.
Right.
Avicenna starts with this concept of existence. And he distinguishes between necessity and contingency.
Right.
But Sadra's proof starts with existence itself. Right. Existence as this simple, perfect reality.
Okay.
And he's saying, look, God is the ultimate perfection.
Right.
The absolute intensity of this existence.
And because existence is, graded,
right,
there has to be this limiting point.
There has to be a limit.
Yeah. This absolute maximum.
And that is God.
So it's almost like this direct ascent.
It is, yeah.
From the nature of existence to God.
Exactly. It's not about like inferring a cause.
Right.
It's about recognizing God as the perfection of existence.
Oh, okay. Okay. And the term, Siddiq, veracious.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. It seems like he's using it in a slightly different way than Avicenna used it.
Yeah, for Avicenna, the Siddiq is basically just, someone who affirms a truth.
Right.
Like they recognize a truth.
Yeah.
But for Sadra, the Siddiq has this additional dimension of intuition, inner disclosure.
Right.
Which is attained through, spiritual practice and grace.
So the proof isn't just this kind of cold logical argument.
No, there's this real, experiential element to it.
Yeah. Okay, so, I mean, obviously this kind of proof has been, subject to some criticisms.
Yeah, the same criticisms that you often see leveled at, ontological arguments.
Right.
Which, Sadra's proof shares some similarities with.
Right, like maybe it's circular?
Right, maybe you're already assuming the conclusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the really interesting philosopher Tabatabai, he actually suggested that, maybe Sadra's proof isn't even a strict demonstration,
Yeah.
but more like an assertoric argument.
Yeah. Yeah, basically like a reminder of something that we already know.
Okay. So maybe that's why Sadra himself sometimes calls it, a way or a thought experiment.
Right. Right. He's not saying that this is like, an airtight logical thing that's going to convince everyone.
Yeah.
He's saying this is a way to think about things.
Right. Okay, now I think, to kind of round things out here, we should also look at, how Mulla Sadra approaches, knowledge itself, his epistemology.
Yeah. How do I know?
Yeah.
What does it mean to know? And this is another area where, his metaphysics really deeply shapes his views.
Right.
So one of the really key things here is this idea of mental existence.
Okay.
Which he sees as this distinct ontological realm.
Okay.
And it's equivalent to existence knowledge.
Okay.
Which allows him to explain how we can think about, things that don't exist.
Right.
Non-existent entities.
Okay. So like if I think about, a unicorn.
A unicorn.
That thought itself has a kind of being.
It does, yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Even though there's no unicorn running around out there.
Right.
There's a unicorn in your mind.
In the mental realm.
In the mental realm, yeah.
Okay. Now, but when it comes to actual things that exist out there, how do we know those?
Right. How do we get at those?
Yeah.
So Sadra looked at a bunch of different theories of knowledge that had come before, and he kind of, rejected a couple of them.
Okay.
He didn't like the correlational model.
Which basically says, knowledge is just this relationship between the knower and the known.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No real cognitive content.
Right.
And he also wasn't satisfied with the correspondence or representation theory.
Which, for a lot of people, that's kind of the go-to, right?
Well, yeah. The idea that, our minds mirror reality, right? We have these representations.
Right.
And they correspond.
Yeah.
But he found both of these kind of inadequate.
Okay.
Especially when it came to certainty.
Right. And so what did he propose as this kind of higher form of knowledge?
So he goes back to this idea that we've already touched on a couple times.
Okay.
This knowledge by presence.
Right.
Al-ilm al-huduri al-shuhuri.
Okay.
And like we said, it's not a brand new idea. Suhrawardi talks about it.
Right.
But Sadra grounds it very firmly in his own kind of metaphysical framework.
Okay.
And this knowledge by presence, it's really about this direct, unmediated apprehension of reality.
Okay.
There's no need for representations.
Yeah.
There's no need for concepts.
It's really this immediate awareness.
It's immediate.
Yeah.
And he says this is really crucial for understanding divine knowledge.
Right.
But also, again, for understanding our own, inner states.
Right.
Our thoughts and feelings.
And how does this, fit with, his commitment to reason?
Right. So again, he sees them as working together.
Okay.
Knowledge by presence is like the ground.
The foundation.
The foundation, yeah.
Yeah.
And reason is what kind of leads us to that foundation.
Right.
And in connection to that, he, again, defends this idea of the identity of the intellect and what is intellected.
Okay.
Which, Avicenna was critical of.
Right.
But Sadra says, no, ultimately there's this unity.
Yeah.
And it's grounded in the fact that, existence is one and existence is in motion.
Right.
So the intellect can kind of unite with the object that it's understanding.
At the level of existence. Expert.